Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is the author of the Perry Harbor series of steamy romance novels, as well as a couple of standalone romance books. Her name is Christina Braver, and my interview with Christina will follow the teleportation sound. Due to the discussion of sexually explicit literature during the interview, listener discretion is advised. Christina Braver, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
My name is Christina Braver, and I write small town steamy romance.
Okay, my next question, that is the shortest response I've ever had to the feel free to introduce yourself to your listeners.
Oh, let's see. Well, I can absolutely say more. I love to talk about sex positivity. I think that reading romance can make your sex life better. I have a lot of things to say. That will be the shortest answer to any question that you ask me. So fear not. If you ask me a question, I will go on and on. I've been writing as my third career. I started out I have a master's in clinical psychology, and I started out as a therapist for a few years. And then I started working in hospitals, and I loved that environment. And I moved into healthcare technology. I worked for the majority of my career has been in healthcare technology. And then with COVID, I got laid off. And my husband said, I couldn't go back to work full time. We had some things going on in our family. Someone needed to stay home, at least part time. And so my husband said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to read romance novels all the time. And he said, well, why don't you write one? So, because reading romance novels all day long is really not a realistic way to spend my time. So it was the truest answer to the question. So he said, why don't you write one? And so I did. And I haven't looked back. I've been writing for about 4 years, published since 2021. And I just love it. So I just love it.
Without spoiling too much of the books in your 6-book Perry Harbor romance novel series, which consists of most of the books you've written, what is the series and each book in it about?
Wow, let's see. No one has ever asked me that question, believe it or not. So they are about what I say, swoony heroes and strong heroines. Mostly they are about, they're all different. So they're all about sex positivity. They're all about painting a picture of a relationship that is positive, but not also a little bit of a fantasy. Romance is fantasy. That is what it's about to a great extent, just like Star Wars and Star Trek and all the other fantasy, Lord of the Rings, all the fantasies that we have. Romance is a fantasy just like that. So there are a lot of the heroes are very dreamy, but also I try to keep some realism there. I read myriad books by sex therapists, and I try to put a lot of real sex tips in the sex scenes. So you're not going to have some of those fantastical scenes where, it's like, how explicit can I be in this podcast? I should have asked you. How explicit can I be in this podcast?
There really aren't too many guardrails for authors like you.
Okay, great. So you aren't going to have the situation where it's like, 3 pumps and she orgasms, and that's a fantastical experience. That's not reality when it comes to sex. So I try to have much more realistic perceptions of sex in my steamy scenes. So I think the main book that all the books are about sex positivity. That's the overarching theme. But they're also about real men, real issues, real sex. Sex isn't all, sure, it's fantasy, so it goes somewhat smoothly, but not always smoothly. For example, in my first book, Your Two Lips, the heroine has severe endometriosis, which 6 million women in the United States suffer from endometriosis at varying degrees. It can cause very painful sex. So oftentimes women with endometriosis don't have positive sexual experiences. They don't have a lot of sexual experience. this character in the first chapter, you find this out, I'm not spoiling anything, has to have a hysterectomy. And then she's a nurturer by archetype. She wants a family, but this isn't something that's going to be available to her naturally. So she decides she's going to go on this mission to, reignite her sex life that she's never really experienced. And so she meets a man and he thinks he's got this whole sex thing down. He's kind of a player. Turns out she's a little more complicated than, it turns out women are different, and you can't, what works with one doesn't work with the other. So they embark on this journey to find a healthy sexual relationship together. It's new for him, it's new for her. So it's sort of an exploration of, each book is sort of an exploration about our wounds and how those wounds impact our sex lives. And they all have different wounds.
Yeah, before I ask the remaining questions this interview, I'll just let you know that one of the few guardrails I have for authors like you is that you can't talk about stuff like statutory rape, like what Matt Gaetz was allegedly involved in.
Oh, of course. And let me be clear. I would never talk about that. Romance novels, that is not okay. So particularly historically, that kind of behavior was something that was danced around in older romance novels. Today's romance novels, that is not something that, it's called non-consensual sex at any age is not okay. And typically you will not have an explicit romance novel that has characters that are under 18. So most editors, most authors would never write that because of the backlash that those authors would receive. So because it's not okay, frankly. So most authors don't write non-consensual sex. If they do write a non-consensual sex scene in their book, there is a trigger warning about that. There's a warning included in the beginning of the book that book contains that sort of information. And that is something that is typically flagged by Amazon and other large distributors, that they will not distribute books that include that. So it's rare. It's very rare to find that. And that's not included in my books. And it's certainly not something that I would talk about for exactly the reason you said. It's just not okay.
In addition to the Perry Harbor series, you've written a couple of standalone romance books, Formula One Noel and Vegas Baby. Without spoiling too much of each of those books, what are each of them about?
So Formula One Noel is really about performance and the pressure that comes with two people who are high performers. So he's a Formula One race car driver. There are 20 right now. At any one given time, there are 20 people in the world that have that job. That's a pretty high performance level job. There's not 20 people in the world that want that job. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of people that want that job, but there's only 20 people that get to do it. So that's a level of performance that's pretty high. She is an emergency room physician, also another area that has a pretty high performance curve. There's not a lot of room for error in the ER, and you come into a situation with very little information and you have to make life and death decisions on the fly. That's a high performance situation as well. So these two characters are, when they meet, they are they're both sort of at a crossroads, which typically, as you probably know, stories begin when the status quo has to change. Something external or internal forces the status quo of the character or characters to change. So that's when the story begins. So these two characters meet when she's at a crossroads professionally. She's thinking of making a career change. He's at a crossroads professionally. He's thinking of making a career change and retiring. They meet. They don't know each other. They have a steamy one night stand, and then decide, mayhem ensues, and they understand that they have a lot more in common than they have different, because they're both in these high performance professional situations. So that is also about like the wound that they're experiencing, and then how a relationship with another person, and particularly a sexual relationship, can help to heal that wound. Vegas Baby is pretty similar. Vegas Baby is a novella, and it's what I tend to refer to it as a little bit more tropey and maybe mainstream romance, what you would expect, though it's definitely real sex, it's definitely real people, but there's a little less conflict in that book. However, she is pregnant with someone else's baby. When these two are, it's enemies to lovers romance. They work together. They don't like each other. Well, he likes her. She doesn't like him. She has a one night stand, ends up getting pregnant. She's in Las Vegas to tell the father that she's pregnant. He's in Las Vegas for a conference. Neither one of them knew that they were going to be there. They run into each other, and it's an opportunity to just like Formula One Noel, it's an opportunity to take a break from reality and just be together for the weekend. They're in Vegas. What stays in, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. They discover, after this connection that he does have feelings for her, she does have feelings for him, and they sort of develop a relationship going forward. But both of those books are about sort of taking a break from the real world or the status quo and exploring something new, and then finding out that the status quo was not where you wanted to be, that you can't stay in the status quo forever where it's comfortable. You have to grow and grow forward. So that's what both of those books are about.
What motivates you to write steamy romance fiction, and where do you get your ideas for the sex scenes in your books?
What motivates me to write steamy is, well, I don't think I could write anything else. So I have my stories are character driven. So I focus a lot on the character's wounds. And again, like I said, the wounds and how working with relationships helps to heal those wounds. I think a lot happens between a couple in the bedroom when you are both figuratively and literally naked with someone. The communication that takes place in that situation is going to be intense and serious, regardless if you're joking around together or if you're, quietly, feverishly focused on each other. The communication, physical and verbal, is very intense and adds a lot to the relationship. So I didn't feel that I could paint an appropriate picture of the relationship without being in the bedroom during that time. And I do think sex is a big part of human relationship. So that's why I write it, because I just don't know that I could write it I could write quality relationships between two characters without including that intimate part of their life. Where I get my ideas from, I mentioned I read myriad books by sex therapists. There's a lot of information that's not represented out in the world that's real and sexy and romantic, that happens between two people, but it's not the typical what you see certainly not what you see in porn, and not what you see in movies and on television, and not always even what you see in sexy rom-coms. There's a lot of different things that play into a sexual relationship. Each sexual relationship is going to be different. We're all different people. When we come together for a combination, that's a different combination than those two lovers would have with other lovers. So there's a lot of different ways that we can express ourselves lovingly and sexually. And so depending on what our wounds are and how those wounds come together and our personalities, that shows up in the bedroom. Whether or not we're confident in the bedroom, do we talk about our fantasies or not? Book 4, my fourth book in the Perry Harbor series, is called Your Turn. And she is a sexual shame culture survivor. So she has a lot of voices in her head that are telling her that sex is bad, that she's dirty, it's wrong that she wants it, she's not supposed to like it. He also has some history, not necessarily with sexual shame culture, but comes from some performance shame issues. So men often struggle with the idea that they're, number one, supposed to know how to do everything, like from birth. I guess they're supposed to know. It just comes magically with the Y chromosome, that men are just supposed to know how to perform in the bedroom. That isn't true. Men have to learn the same way that anyone else does. But I think a lot of men in real life struggle with performance and knowing what to do and knowing how to please their partner. And her hero, his name is Reese, is no different. So he's got some struggles around sex in that regard. And then, of course, she has this shame that she's trying to overcome and move past. And the story begins when they're both sort of ready to take the next step with someone, and they meet each other and grow together. So their sexual encounters are going to be very different than what I talked about in the first book, where they have a different set of wounds from Your Two Lips, those two characters with her history of having a hysterectomy and his sort of history of being a player. They have when they come together, their sexual relationship is very different. So I look at the characters, I look at the wounds, I look at what they're trying to accomplish and heal in their personal lives, and how that might impact their sex lives and what sex might look like for them. He has to be, for example, in Your Turn with Reese having the performance issues and her having or not performance issues, but performance pressure, and her having the history of shame. He has to be very cognizant of pushing her, anything that seems like it might be forceful. He has to be very cognizant and sensitive about her and how she's going to perceive his overtures. And she wants him to be aggressive, but then that's that part of her that's like, no, I can't handle it. So they have to talk through that. What she wants is a guy who kind of takes charge in the bedroom, but that's also in her mind, she's been taught that that's a very shameful thing. So they have to sort of work out how to figure out how to be together in a way that's pleasing for both, safe and pleasing for both of them. And I think that's a very common thing that happens in real relationships. So that's why I try to put those kinds of things in my novel. And that's where I get my inspiration.
Are all your books self-published, and what is involved in self-publishing a book?
Great question. Yes, all of my books are self-published. I made the decision to go to self-publishing. Side note, some people say that only the people that can't get traditionally published are self-published, and that is not true. Certainly not in romance, for a variety of reasons. But there's a lot of people who self-publish, particularly in romance, because they want to write the story that they want to write. Traditional publishing historically in romance, up until about 2019, in 2019, there was a huge sort of scandal in Romance Writers of America, which is the largest romance writing organization. It was the largest romance writing organization in the US, maybe in the world. They had a huge scandal over racism, and many of the traditional publishers were embroiled in that scandal as well. Certainly did not come out clean. So a lot of people who were traditionally published and successful in that area reported, being told that the only romance stories that anyone wanted to read was about a white, good-looking heterosexual couple. And so if you weren't a white, good-looking heterosexual couple, your book didn't get published. So that is not true. Everybody deserves to see themselves represented in a romance novel, and everyone is not white, heterosexual, and good-looking. So, conventionally good-looking. So, the romance industry really broke away from that stereotype and started to have much more diverse audiences. And that sparked a lot of self-publishing. So it's actually not uncommon at all to be self-published in the romance world. So yes, all my books are self-published. And also I did that because I had heard, as I was trying to decide about going with a traditional publisher, I had heard of some authors, they had characters with a certain demographic. So say they had an older character, their character was in their early 30s, and they sold their book to a traditional publisher, and the traditional publisher changed their age to 25 because the publisher said that no one would buy a romance novel about someone in their 30s. And my books are intentionally the way they are for the reasons that we talked about, right? I want to write about sex positivity. I want to write about real sex information, in a fantastical world to a certain extent, but I want there to be some real information in there. And I wasn't confident that a traditional publisher would support that mission of mine. And that's really close to my heart. And that's why I write, and that's important to me. So I chose not to even pursue traditional publishing and to just stick with self-publishing. But there's nothing wrong there. But the process of getting self-published became much easier. It's much easier of late. KDP with Amazon, that program really helps walk a new author through how to self-publish a digital book as well as a paperback. There's tons of information available out there about other ways to Ingram Spark is a can produce paperbacks for you. Draft to Digital is another service where you can create your ebooks and those kinds of things to make them available for other platforms other than Amazon, platforms like Nook and Kobo and Google Play and those kinds of things. So there's a lot that goes into self-publishing. The ins and outs of it, are kind of summarized with ebooks and paperbacks using those tools that are out there. But also, if you're self-published, you have to have a social media presence. You have to manage your website, your marketing. So there's a whole other realm that at one time traditional publishers did. I'm hearing from other authors nowadays that traditional publishers are not doing that as much as they used to, that authors are having to also do that for themselves, the marketing component as well. So there's a lot that goes into self-publishing, but in a nutshell, that's kind of an overview.
I have one final question. What do you like most about living in the Pacific Northwest?
Oh gosh, I like so many things about living here. That's really hard to say. I love the weather. I love the rain. I love the sun. The temperature. For the most part, I love the people. I grew up in the southeastern United States, and I'm a sex positive woman with a voice and an education, and I'm not very good at demurring, and I felt very much like I needed to do that in the culture in which I was raised in that part of the United States. I don't feel that in the Pacific Northwest. I feel a little bit more like these are my people, that it's much more culturally accepted for me to be sex positive and open and talkative and out about that kind of information. So I own that some of that is the culture that I grew up in. Some of that is the way that I felt in the culture that I grew up in. So I haven't, it's been decades since I've lived in the southeastern United States, so I don't know what it's like there now, but at the time it wasn't the right fit for me. And so what I love most about living in the Pacific Northwest is I feel like this is where I belong. These are my people. I feel more connected with the culture and the vibe. And so I just feel like these are my people.
Christina, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the time.
Christina was an amazing guest for this podcast, and it was wonderful to discuss steamy romance literature with her. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.